holding on to in fear. And yet somehow we've gotten to a point in that storm where we ask the question, don't you even care? Well, yeah. He's the one who gave it to you to start with. He certainly cares. And he's with you, and he's been with you the whole time. But Jesus speaks, and nature obeys, just as it did when he spoke the world into existence. And then the next part of the story, Jesus looks at the disciples and he asks them, why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? And this is interesting to me because every time I read this, I think, man, Jesus was a lot harder on people than I am. Jesus speaks in this way to the disciples, and I think about the ways that I might, as a pastor, as a friend, come alongside somebody who's going through a storm in life, and many times I'm telling them things like, hey, your emotions are valid, what you're feeling makes sense, and it does to a point. And this is where I'm going, we might think that their response was natural. They were in a moment when they thought they were going to die. Well, Jesus definitely didn't think that their response was what it should have been. Maybe Jesus would have said, yes, your response is very natural, but I've called you to more. And because of you knowing who I am, shouldn't that change the way that you look at the circumstances around you? Because we know who Jesus is, shouldn't that change the way that I look at my relationships? Shouldn't that change the way that I look at my finances? Shouldn't that change the way that I look at my job situation? Shouldn't that change the way that I look at my goals and my priorities and everything else that I'm valuing? Shouldn't the fact that Jesus is the one in the boat with me, shouldn't that change the way that I'm thinking about these things? Jesus certainly indicates that it should have. But Jesus doesn't pull any punches. He looks at them and says, do you guys still have no faith? You've seen me work miracles. You've been with me. I called you to follow me. You left everything, but yet you still have no faith. And I think there's implication here for the way that we as disciples need to examine our own thoughts and lives. But I also think there's implication here for the way that we need to disciple others. You see, Jesus doesn't coddle their lack of faith. He doesn't give them an excuse for it. He doesn't tell them it's okay that you have no faith. Jesus calls it out. He points it out to them. Because here's the thing, guys, if we don't hold one another accountable in discipleship, if we don't lead one another to the faith that we ought to have, if we don't point out, then we can't grow. Then the people we're leading, the people that we're trying to impact for Jesus can't grow. And so I certainly know that there are times in my life where I need you guys right here to look at me and say, Pastor, you need to remember who it is that's in the boat with you. You need to remember that the one who created all this is still with you. You need to place your faith in Jesus. I know it's hard. I know it hurts. I know you're terrified. But would you be that terrified if you realized who it is that's in the boat with you? But the other thing that I think is important to point out is the other part of this, and that is that Jesus also doesn't get to shore and tell them, you know what, you guys aren't worth it anymore. See you later. I've been doing miracles and you guys still don't get it. This is another part of discipleship. Jesus is expressing, I think, frustration with the people that he's discipling. And Jesus is going to do this at multiple points as he disciples these men. There's actually one point at which Jesus kind of rolls his eyes and says, how long do I have to be with you guys? Like, at what point do you get it? Here's the thing, discipleship, when we're discipling others, and we, by the way, need to remember this as for those of us who are discipling us as well, we can be frustrating people to deal with. And so ask Lily, I can be whiny. And at the same time, as we disciple others, there are moments where it's taxing. Where it seems, where you're looking at the person you're discipling and you're going, how many times do we go through this lesson? How many times do we go through the same storms and have to go back to the same points? You know what the answer is? As many times as it takes. Because ultimately, that's what Jesus did with his disciples. He stayed with them, he prepared them, until it took. So Jesus looks at him and he says, why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? And Jesus is pointing out the issue that I think is the big takeaway from this, and that is when we realize who it is that's in the boat with us, then our faith should be in him, and our reliance should be on him. You see, the active agent in this is not the storm, because the power that's greater than the storm is the one that spoke. You look at the last verse, and it's really, really interesting. We're going to dive into it. Kinsley's going to help me explain it. Verse 41, Mark writes, the disciples were absolutely terrified. Why? The storm stopped. Jesus calmed the storm. This is what they said. Who is this man? They asked each other. Even the wind and waves obey him. And that brings us to the last point for this morning. This went by a lot faster than I intended for it to. The apostles were terrified at the end of the story. It says they were absolutely terrified. And the indication is that they were more terrified now than they were when they were in the midst of the storm. They wondered, who is this? See, their response to Jesus is one of awe and fear as they recognize that they are in the presence of a greater power than the storm that threatened them. And I think that this is important as we look at the way that Jesus moves and the way that Jesus acts and the way that Jesus and who Jesus is as we come face to face with the reality of the God that we serve, with who he is, then there should be a holy fear that comes over us. You can find this throughout the scriptures, by the way. You can go back to Abraham, Moses. You think about Moses' reaction when he sees a burning bush that's not being burned up, and he's like, cool, I want to go see that. And you're like, okay, you're like the kid who sees the stove on and wants to go touch it. But all right. So Moses walks up to the bush that's burning and isn't being burned up. I mean, he notices that this is a strange phenomenon, and he's not afraid of that. But when the bush speaks to him and he realizes God's talking to him, then he's terrified. So, makes sense. Fast forward, you've got other passages, other people. Isaiah comes to mind. When Isaiah sees the vision of who God is, he is immediately filled with fear. You go to John in the book of Revelation. John is Jesus' closest disciple. He calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. I like that. Because it's kind of like John's going, you know what? I'm the one Jesus really likes. Like, you know, you think about kids and they're like, you know, I'm dad's favorite or I'm mom's favorite. You know, this is what John's doing. He's like, I'm the beloved disciple. I'm the one Jesus really likes. So that's John. And John, in the Last Supper, John's the one that lays his head on Jesus' chest. Now, there are very few dudes, and I think there are two in here that have had this happen. There are very few dudes that are allowed to lay their head on my chest. That's how close these guys are. That's how close John is with Jesus. But John in the book of Revelation comes face to face with Jesus in his glory, and it says, "And I fell at his feet as dead," because he was terrified. There's this great fear that comes over the disciples as they realize who Jesus is. And I think about our thoughts of who Jesus is. And I ask the question, when was the last time that we were fearful? When was the last time we were filled with such an awe and fear of who Jesus is that we literally understood it as fear? And I think about a book that Randy and I are reading a book right now called Read Jesus. I recommend it for anybody who's looking for something to read. If you don't have enough books to read right now, read Jesus. It's good. But in that book, one of the things that the authors talk about are the images that we have created of Jesus. And they talk about things like bearded lady Jesus and spooky Jesus, and and what they're talking about are like the medieval paintings and the images that our culture creates of Jesus. And they'll talk about things like the ways that we've created these images of Jesus that look like we imagine him to be. And oftentimes these are softened. They may emphasize only one aspect of something about Jesus. Sometimes they've stripped him of his humanity. That's the spooky Jesus. Sometimes they've created a version of Jesus that reflects more, tells us more about the person who's doing the painting than it does about the Jesus who's the subject. And a lot of times I think that that's the problem that we have, is that our picture of Jesus isn't one that leads us to be filled with awe or fear, to be amazed by who he is. I think about this, and I've used this illustration before. A missions professor and my missions professor in my master's work, and I were having a conversation one day, and he's from Kenya. And he was actually talking about, we were comparing the ways that African Christians think of God and the ways that American Christians think of God. And one of the things that as we were talking about this, he said, you guys think of God as like your buddy. Like he's your friend, he's your pal, we emphasize that intimacy that we want with God in the ways that we talk about him, in the ways that we think about God. We often think of him as the friend who's close to us. And he said, we're African Christians, we struggle. That's what he said. We struggle with that image of God because to us, God is someone who is otherworldly. God is powerful. God is someone who is untouchable. And we actually talked through the difficulties that this raises for the church in each of these cultures, and the ways that in Kenya, Christians struggle with intimacy with God because they can't fathom God being close to them. So they struggle with intimacy with God, whereas in America, our Christianity struggles with reflecting a reverence and an awe and a respect and an obedience to God. See, a Kenyan Christian who's certain he's heard from God has no problem obeying. An American Christian might. And I think that now anybody who's interested, I'm not going to rabbit trail into this, but there are reasons why I think this happens, that there are reasons why this happens, particularly in each of these cultures. And for anybody, so I'm teasing a conversation with anybody who wants to have it. But ultimately, I think that's the problem, is that we end up, as American Christians, we tend to think of God, who we see as our friend and our buddy. And the problem is that the God who is our friend and our buddy is not a God who's powerful enough to calm the storm we're going through. He's not the one you want in the boat. So I ask the question, is this perhaps why sometimes we treat Jesus' commands as suggestions? Because we lack this kind of holy fear of who God is. I do want to point out a few things about what it means to fear God, because here's the struggle that I have and that I think most pastors have as they try to teach on fear of God. By the way, Proverbs says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's where wisdom starts, is when we start to recognize who God is and we have a holy fear of him. The struggle is that what we tend to try to do is we try to frame this in a way that where it's a positive thing. And we're trying, because fear is typically a negative thing, right? You think of something that you're fearful of, you don't think, oh, that's something I tend to run away from, because fear leads us to run away rather than to approach. And we don't want people to have that kind of an understanding of God. And I agree with that. I want to be clear on that. I think that that is the danger of the word fear in the English language. But there's another problem. And that is whenever we start talking about, oh, well, what we mean when we say fear is like respect. What we mean when we say fear is just thinking about how amazing something is. Here's the problem with that. Respect really doesn't evoke the kind of emotion, the kind of response that I think is appropriate for the God who speaks the worlds into existence. When we talk about respect, that's kind of the emotion that I should feel for pretty much anybody at some level, right? Like, I should respect everybody. And so I feel like the word respect kind of just neuters the power that we're trying to put into this, neutralizes. I'll use a more appropriate word there. Sorry, I said what I said and I meant it. It strips the fear of its power and what is meant in this passage. And then I think when we talk about awe, being amazed by something, well, I'm amazed by the mountains. I'm amazed by lots of things that have no bearing on how I live, that don't impact the way that I respond to them, because they're not active agents in my life. And so that's where I'm going. I think fear is an appropriate word, but we've got to understand it in a way that we don't typically understand fear. Does that make sense? And so I think, number one, the reality of understanding fear of God we need to first put away the idea that fear is something that is only felt for things that are not good or not trustworthy. Because we do fear things that are not good and that are not trustworthy. But I don't think but when we fear God, we need to realize that, number one, he is good. In fact, one of the reasons I should fear him is not because God is not good, but because I am not good. You think about Isaiah's response and John's response to God, and their fear came from their overwhelming recognition that they were not worthy to stand in the presence of God. And so the fact that God, and understanding that God is trustworthy, and I think that that's the whole point of this story, is that the disciples' lack of fear of who Jesus was led to a lack of faith, even though Jesus was with them in the boat. I think about C.S. Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia and Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The question, and this is a quote that gets used often, but I think it's because it's so great. There's a point in the story where the children are going to meet Aslan the lion, who is the depiction of Jesus in this story. And one of the children asks, but is he safe? And the one who is leading them is the beaver. And Mr. Beaver speaks up and he says, that's literally his name, Mr. Beaver. Mr. Beaver speaks up and says, safe? Of course he isn't safe. He's a lion, but he's good. And I think that that's so powerful as an understanding of who Jesus is. Is Jesus safe? Is life with Jesus safe? You weren't promised a life that's safe. You were promised a life that's abundant and a life that matters, and a life lived on mission, a life filled with the power of God. But you've never been promised a life that's safe. What I can tell you, though, is that there is no better place, even if it's not always the safe place. There is no better. So what we do with this then is to understand that we need that our fear of God, number one, knowing who God is, should lead us to fear him, but should lead us to trust him and to place our faith in him. J.D. Greear says that true worship is all mixed with intimacy. All mixed with intimacy. One without the other is a deformed spirituality. And if you think about that, fear without awe, intimacy without awe. If you love Jesus and you're just singing Jesus, lover of my soul, and that's your theme song, and I'm a friend of God. By the way, I'm not knocking on those songs, but that's your theme, and that's the way you view God, but you have no fear of God, you have no awe for who he is, then that is going to so you've got this love feeling, but no fear. That's going to lead you to disobedience. That's going to lead you to view commands of God that make you uncomfortable. You're going to view them as suspect because you're going to go, well, Jesus loves me so much, he wouldn't call me to do things that make me uncomfortable, would he? He wouldn't do that. Yes, he would. A God that you are intimate with but have no fear of is a God without authority in your life. On the flip of that, though, a God that you have fear without intimacy is a God that you're going to be distant from and that you're going to run away from. You see, God has called you to both, to a relationship where you recognize exactly who he is, but where you are in a relationship that is filled with love and intimacy with him. And that's where we find faith. That's where we find what Jesus is trying to build in us. You see, the apostles needed both. Because here's the thing. If their fear of God was not coupled with a trust and an understanding of his love for them, then it wouldn't matter that Jesus was in the boat. He might let them drown anyway. But Jesus says that it was their lack of faith that kept them from recognizing either A, that he cared enough about them that he wasn't going to let them drown, or B, that he was powerful enough to stop them from drowning, or both. And that's the thing in our lives, because sometimes we're going through a storm and we're convinced that God, it's either that you can't do it, and the God we serve, we're worried that he's not going to be able to overcome the storm because the storm looks so powerful, and we fail to realize that the God we serve is more powerful than the storm, or we've gone to the extreme that we've forgotten the intimacy and the love relationship, and we've said, God, you don't care if I drown. And so either one of those leads us to a loss of faith. So the question comes back to us, and I said this was going to be the questions at the end of the study today. The key. The key is knowing who Jesus is and that he's with you in the boat. And then the question is, what does this mean for you? What does this mean as you follow Jesus? What does it mean for you right now to rely on Jesus, to place your faith in him? What does it mean for you to recognize who Jesus is and that he's in the boat with you? And then secondly, what does it mean for those you're discipling? What does it mean for those that you're trying to help understand who Jesus is? Well, I think one of the things it means we've been talking a lot about what it means for us. So I'm going to leave that at this point to you as a point of application, trying to figure that out. But I will say that for those you're discipling, you need to remember that they're going to go through storms. And like the disciples, they're going to have moments where their faith is not going to be there. They're going to say, doesn't God care that I'm drowning? Doesn't God care that I'm about to be overturned by this storm? And the answer to that question is always pointing them back to a Jesus who is one that has called them to follow him in intimacy, but is so powerful that he's worthy of their fear. Let me pray for us. Father, as we come to the close of this morning's service, God, we thank you for the love that you have for us and that you're in the boat with us. But Jesus, I thank you that you're not just another one of the disciples. You're not just another teacher. You're not just one who has given us a philosophy to follow. You're an active, powerful God, one worthy of our fear, one worthy of our awe. You call us to intimacy with you, and the closer we get to you, may we understand who you are, so that we are amazed by you and we realize that we are in the presence of one who is more powerful than any storm that we're facing, and that you are trustworthy and good. Lord, help us as we follow you to know you, to experience you. We love you. We worship you. We pray all of this in the precious name of Jesus. Amen.
Standing on this mountaintop, looking just how far we've come, knowing that for every step you were with us, kneeling on this battleground, seeing just how much you've done, knowing every victory. Scars and struggles on the way, but with joy our hearts can say, yes, our hearts can say, never once, never once did he ever walk alone, never once did you leave us on our own. You are faithful, God. You make it through. Church, we're gonna make it through. 'Cause our house was built on you.
That concludes today's service. Hang out, chill, relax with each other. Let's fellowship. But yeah, have a great day. Have a great Sunday.